there's the Nietzschean element already within Emerson that, no, we have to acknowledge that it is also suffering.
It's an interesting quote he says very early on in the Plato essay, which again situates us in this sort of space. He says, his broad humanity transcends all sectional lines. So there's an idea here that, you know, Plato is for everyone.
He doesn't think you get there by abstractly thinking about it. You provide people experiences that put them in touch with it.
Welcome to another episode of Platonic Mysticism. Today we're going to do something special because I've taken a recent interest in the philosophy of Emerson. I find it fascinating how many people he's inspired and what he's inspired by. And to do this, we've invited Professor Eli Kramer, a veteran of this show, a member of Palinode Productions, but also somebody whose specialty or expertise is early American philosophy. And he's taught Emerson before, and so I thought he'd be the perfect companion for today's conversation on Emerson, and a few of his essays. And so hopefully this will be a short prelude to a longer episode. Don't think that this is going to be the end of the conversation. So
great to be here. Emerson's a really important figure. He was in graduate school for me, and it's nice to be able to return to him. So, especially in to think about his connections, which I haven't done so directly, and Plato and the Platonic tradition. So looking forward to it.
Well, Gareth, you have a place to start, or would you like me to?
Well, I think just one thing that I think I'd start with is to say, I think any reader of Emerson, and certainly in my first impression, I was just struck with the beauty of his language, you know, his ability to write, and also as an Englishman, the particular kind of idiom of his American English, which I find quite arresting actually, and very beautiful. So I think he's just a great writer, and he has a way in many of his essays of, you know, compelling you to his thought and philosophy in a way that's incredibly erudite, but also very accessible, I think. And I think that's been a big part of his appeal, particularly in his writings on nature. And he's I think, a very kind of quippable writer as well, isn't he? Lots of good one-liners. But yeah, I just thought that this sense of how beautifully he writes, and I guess I'd put that in the context of today in some ways, where I think maybe it's harder to write as well as that now. It strikes me anyway that there's not that many writers writing as he does. But Eli, I don't know, maybe you could say a little bit more about that in terms of his philosophical formation, if you like, the background to his ideas, and particularly, or perhaps, why this sense of beauty is somehow innate within the structure of his language and poetry.
I think I'm sure Danny will be able to add to it. Going to, I know you've been looking at some of his sort of biography and some interesting works on sort of his development. But some of the famous stuff, there's a lot going on in the Emerson story, even from his childhood. From his father being a Unitarian minister, and his aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, being this fascinating Puritan personality, and also writer and thinker, who he would dialogue with till her death in, I think, the 1860s. To give you an image of her, she had a bed made in the shape of a coffin in true sort of Puritan style to remember her death, and had lots of sort of Puritan poetry, looking for signs of election and beauty in nature, and was like a dialogue partner for Emerson through school as he was sort of thinking about his ideas. And one of the things about Puritans thinking that's less known, it's sort of a thread from their grammar books from not Aristotle, but this logician Petrus Ramus, who didn't do syllogistic thinking, but looked for analogical logics, like ways to think about how certain patterns in nature echo each other. And so like built into Emerson is already this idea from a very young age that reality is these signs that point to other sides. You know, the spider's web, the bug trapped in the spider's web is a classic one from Jonathan Edwards, is not merely something in a human consciousness that imagines that's like a metaphor for being trapped. For a Puritan, it is a sign of the way we trap ourselves in webs. And that, you know, if a thread were but cut, we could fall and die. To give an image from Jonathan Edwards, you know, a sermon, sinners in the hand of an angry God, and, you know, fall into the depths of hell. Part of this is the sort of Calvinist to a Puritan thing about, because you're looking for, if you're amongst the elect, you know, you're sort of predestined to heaven or hell. Even in the Puritan community, you're not one of the chosen. And so you need a logic that tells you where to look in for nature about your own status. But then, you know, he just was started to read very broadly. He went to Europe when he was very young. There's a story about particularly his first wife's death that really transforms him. But one I would add that's an important English connection for him is Coleridge and Carlyle are two tremendously influential forces. In fact, he notes that his trip, particularly to Carlyle and visiting him and supporting his book tour in the US, really shaped lots of his thinking. And even in the title Representative Men and sort of thinking about the heroic peoples that help transform the world, you can see sort of a lot of conversation and thinking with people like Carlyle. But I'll just end with why it's hard for me to grapple here is there's just so much going on. If you, in the essay we read about Plato, which we'll talk about later, he's talking about Vishnu because he had just read the Bhagavad Gita and the recent access to some Advaita Vedanta texts. So, you know, he was someone who was deeply committed to this sort of Sophria perennis, deeper access through all traditions. So he was just enormously read, given the resources and access that were available at his time. So,
yeah.
So you know that one of the reasons why I'm reading Emerson again was because I kind of dismissed him as a thinker. I remember trying to, you know, read him, I think in my 20s, and there was just something that felt, as you know, Gareth was saying, almost too accessible. It's a very strange reason why I wasn't interested. But then, you know, coming into my own expertise as a Nietzschean scholar as well as a Platonist, particularly with regards to thus books Zarathustra, I kept re-encountering, you know, Emerson's influence on Nietzsche. And so, you know, I came back and I started reading again, and I'm just falling in love with this really clear Platonist / Neoplatonist / lover of the history of great human beings and thoughts and ideas. But I cannot help but feel, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, that he, like Nietzsche, I think like Plato, have this kind of very spiritual idea about time and greatness and what it means to be, you know, part of this tradition. So that, you know, when he's pointing out all these great men that he admires, or Plato, it's as if he's letting himself be them, right? And then this praise is really for the spirit that he finds within himself. Does that seem a little too woo-woo, or, you know?
No, can I just jump in quickly, like before you answer that, just maybe to step back for a bit of context for those not as familiar with Emerson's work. So born 1803, dies 1882. So, you know, we're dealing with a 19th century thinker, and here, if you think about the bookend of that century in relation to the thinkers we've already cited, Coleridge, Wordsworth, who he met with in England, and of course Nietzsche, who's very influenced by Emerson at the end of that century. So we have this thinker who, in a sense, is part of a very interesting part of American history as well, in terms of the, independence and the sort of more formative side of the nation, if you like, the relation to the European tradition, but also, as you say, the breadth of his reading across other traditions, which is apparent in the Plato essay. And we'll come to that, won't we? But I think it's interesting because he situates Plato rightly in many respects as this kind of thinker who somehow brings together the unity and diversity of Eastern and Western traditions in his thought. But he's known for what's called transcendentalism. But you pointed, Eli, to this idea, I think, of the sense of immanence that pervades his work. And of course, that's very readily apparent in his writings on nature. But you find this even in the introductory texts on great men. A man is a center for nature, running out threads of relation through everything. So there's this idea here of the participative, and Danny's already alluded here to the Platonic, Neoplatonic tradition. Maybe more on that in a while in his relation to someone like Thomas Taylor as well. But yeah, sorry, I just thought it'd be helpful to jump in with a bit more context there.
No, you're right.
well.
And we should also maybe talk about what transcendentalism is in the US version, because it's a little bit complicated. Not a little bit, but there's, I think, sort of European transcendentalism and American transcendentalism have a slightly different bent. Both take this idea from Kant's third critique, especially as it goes from Coleridge, that this feeling that the world around us is one where we can find meaning in, success, development is, sort of points to a sign that our meaning is part of the greater external reality beyond us, and we're an expression of nature. And that's part of this, something about the secret truth to the world, that instead of us being like, that there's our world and then there's the external world around us that we can never really know. There's this idea in the third critique, we can't know for sure, but our experience puts us in the position that we can't help but feel that we're sort of an expression of the greater natural reality. And so both the romantic and transcendentalists key into this idea that there is something between nature, not as like a abstract hypostasis of reality, but as this greater world we're a part of, that points to signs of us as being a sort of inner reflective aspect of it. This is where, and in fact, there's influence lines between Schelling and Emerson, that there's a sort of thematic connection there, and that's not accidental, and in fact, it's sort of the same influences. In the US, there's the addition of Unitarians' thought and what's called the Second Great Awakening, also really shaping sort of the American bent of transcendentalism. The Second Great Awakening is the sort of movement among Protestants in the US to move away from this Puritan sense of sort of self-discipline and what is perceived as coldness to the sort of vital energy of the Holy Spirit, that there's something that ought to be alive about religious life. There's a famous piece by Emerson called a sort of theological school address, which is not considered part of the Second Great Awakening, but is criticizing the deadness of church life. He basically quits being a preacher because he's so tired of what he feels is like an empty religious experience. He even talks in it being in like listening to another boring sermon as you look out and see the beauty of nature outside of your window and sort of divine manifestation. Why would you enclose it when there's something so present and deep? And like the Unitarian side is interesting because it has the sort of rational element, but also a lot of Unitarians at the time get, through the Channings, really get into this like ecstatic in touch with wilderness, with nature, with broader experience. Margaret Fuller, who becomes a big influence on Emerson, meets the First Nation peoples sort of across the Midwest, and that's very transformative to her. So there's like, yeah, maybe that's a sort of another piece of Emerson, that nature, inner and outer, are signs that point to each other, and we're looking for sort of symbols and hints of this greater order. And I think also his purpose, with the sort of literature element, even he would say, is like, he doesn't think you get there by abstractly thinking about it. You provide people experiences that put them in touch with it. And to one thing to sort of hint at how much order he has in his thinking, his library was filled with index cards with ideas. Everything from eros to agape to, I don't know, apartheia or atman. And he would index different primary source texts he had in his library with a library code and put them on note cards. So whenever he was preparing, a public lecture, which a lot of these essays come out from, and should tell you a lot also about the framing of the style for that audience, he would like go back to them and then sort of see as he was organizing his ideas. And for example, I've seen several very good scholars of Emerson look at the nature essay in a very cool, complex schemes of showing you the sort of orders and dimensions of reality, how he sees they work together. But that's different from the order of exhibition of how he wants you to experience them, which he is sort of very good at making distinct for himself. Which, I think one of the things I love about Emerson is someone who has a very deep and ordered connection to sort of both culture and study and nature, but is really interested in providing people with experiences of engagement over necessarily a sort of scholarly rote version, which is well and fine, but his thing is this other way of engagement.
Well, you can actually see this when he's writing on Plato in the addendum to his essay on Plato, where he describes Plato. Plato subtly commanded him to men of thought. The secret of his popular success is the moral aim which endeared him to mankind. Intellect, he said, is king of heaven and earth. But in Plato, intellect is always moral. Right. And so this emphasis that this is almost like the ringing of philosophy as a way of life. Right. Like philosophy is the organon, it's the instrument that gets us to be able to grasp the ungraspable. But at the end of the day, the ungraspable part of it, the infinite part of it, the abyss part of it is actually what you receive that makes you. And this was one of my favorite quotes. I loved reading this. Oh, where to go? I hope I have it. Here, the be bold. Oh, there it is. But his circumspection never forsook him. One would say he has read the inscription on the gates of Bizarane. Is that right? Bizarane?
I don't even know how you do that either. I was wondering too.
And it's be bold. And on the second gate, be bold, and ever more bold. And then again, has he paused well at the third gate? Be not too bold. And so like this kind of, he's inspired by the active energies. One of the things that reminds me of Nietzsche is why Nietzsche fell in love with the pre-Socratics, this kind of leaping spirit that he sees in his kin, or I believe he sees in his kin. And that's one of the reasons why he can see that courageous spirit in Plato and others can't. And so.
Yeah, maybe this gets to your point, Danny, about seeing himself. I would describe it, and maybe Gareth has this in the part of the introduction to Representative Men. That part of the idea is these are all aspects of man in the universal, and so like of course you see yourself in them because they're all sort of shards, over expressions of this deeper thing to be a human being. And so he sort of thinks about this, yes, himself, but also like others. To give an interesting example, someone pulled up is when he helped publish the first collection of Thoreau's essays, he called him a Stoic. But when you try to pin him down on what he means by a Stoic, he just meant a universal expression of the philosophical attitude, not like the particular school of Stoicism, because he's never really interested in the archetype of the particular when he's in this mode of thinking. He's always thinking in this sort of representative form. So it is him and it isn't him. It is him in the way it's all of us, but also he loves, like, because he has that sort of same Collingwoody, like he wants to get you into the life world of this person to see what sort of aspect they overexpress. Like it's always, that sort of Emerson move of experience, even says that like in his American Scholar address that like The danger of the bookworm is, the one you've talked about, that the past sort of adds up to us and kills us, and we don't know how that, don't have the empowerment to act. And so, like, these are models of inspiration, aspects of us to sort of lure people to images of transformation. But he shies and resists and does not like anything that would be like not a part of you. Like, it's sort of a weird way to say it. He thinks it's like a good thing that it's him in there, else it would be doing this wrong.
And yeah, this is one of the reasons why I loved his section on Socrates, right? Where he's talking about how Socrates basically tells, a would-be disciple, I can't teach you anything. Either the spirit's gonna light me up and you'll see the inspiration in me, or you'll just see that I'm ugly, but you'll stick around because you want some sort of gift that I'm gonna give you. But ultimately, you're just going to annoy me because you don't see the so to speak fire in my soul. And I just love that, because it's acknowledging that these people, these great minds, are not men for all seasons, right? That some people can see it and some people can't, and that's, for Emerson at least, the way he's writing about Plato, through the grace of God, right? And so I find that beautifully refreshing, I guess. And so
yeah, I think this is something we've picked up on a number of times, isn't it? The idea, and you can find it in different Platonists and Christian Platonists, of turning into the inner kingdom, or closing your eyes and changing your way of seeing, as Plotinus says. And this is precisely Emerson's attitude. I mean, this is a quotation from Nature. Beauty is the mark God sets upon virtue. We are taught by great actions that the universe is the property of every individual in it. Every rational creature has all nature for his dowry and estate. So there's this idea, that there's a sort of gift, a kind of grace in nature, that you have a certain kind of access to, but you need to shape your perception towards that. And this is aside to his more, I guess, metaphysical remarks. If we jump back into the representative men of quotations, like, man made of the dust of the world does not forget his origin, and all that is yet inanimate will one day speak and reason. So here, this is a kind of a logos philosophy, in a sense, too, that nature is reasonable, and as you said, Eli, in a way, by our intuition of transcendence or experience of it, we can also come to speak of it.
He also has an essay. I think this is one of the things that sometimes rubs people around him, and it's his, especially the first series of essays. The Representative Men is later and is a little more mature on this. But if you read Nature, which is a very early, he's in his 30s, 40s when he's doing these, but early in terms of his famous stuff, it sounds very optimistic. You read Nature, you go to the transcendent eyeball, it's about human empowerment, it's sort of this Nietzschean Promethean will to power, but in a positive way. But he does have later stuff, like a second Nature essay where he talks about nature as being, nearly frozen to death in the cold, in the ice, in the snow. So he does have, it's not exactly a Lovecraft, but nature is resistance to us and destructive. I think for him, well, what I say, it's so interesting. I guess the part I like about him is, like, for him, those are all shards of expression, and they don't need to be lined up for the sort of reasons he told about that, because that's not the way intellect works when it engages in the world. So of course it's pluralistic and incommensurable. At one experience, you're on a walk in nature, and you can have experience of being a divine part of things. And a couple years later, you're out in the snow, or maybe even the next week, there's a terrible snowstorm, and you're gonna die out there, and your certitude about the universal looks entirely different. That's not a problem for him.
But this is why I found his Plato essay so refreshing as well, because you can see that he is an adherent to the unwritten doctrines, where Plato had two main principles, which is the limit and the unlimited, or the one and the indefinite dyad. I actually think those supersede the limit and the unlimited, but neither here nor there for now. But the point is that in the essay, you could see that Emerson has caught that particular spirit of the power of the great and the small, right? Where in the small is the great, and in the great is the small, and this kind of Russian doll kaleidoscope, or as he starts calling it, the two poles or extremes, where, you know, both of them are part and parcel of what it means to tap in to this infinite origin, this impossibility that is always motivating Plato's desires, but I think also Emerson's desires. And it shows that he is a good example of, you know, transcending the scholarship of the time, because, you know, really internalizing Plato's unwritten doctrines was not, I don't believe, the norm for most scholars or philosophers in the 19th century. And so, you know, getting the fact that nature and the world soul, or what he calls the oversoul, or that this spirit is also dangerous and it's an abyss. There's the Nietzschean element already within Emerson, that no, we have to acknowledge that it is also suffering. It is also like he describes Plato, that we don't know who he is because in his day-to-day life it was trivial. This was a great line. It reminded me of Gloria Anzaldúa. He crushed all his companions into paint, right? Like they became just, so all of his day-to-day was just resource and fodder for his own genius. And yeah, that's a kind of up and down beauty, where he imagines that Plato is bored most of the day, but turns it into art later in the day.
So this maybe we can kind of hone in a bit on that particular essay. So Representative Men, the collection of which Plato or the philosopher is part, was published in January 1850. There were some later editions reprinted in the 1850s, 1870s. But maybe we can talk a little bit about this, you know, out of the sort of themes we've introduced here, and we've jumped in and out of a few quotes here. But even on the first page, you're struck by some remarkable quotes, and it's reminiscent of the, you know, Whitehead footnotes to Plato kind of idea here, isn't it? Because he says, out of Plato come all things that are still written and debated among men of thought. Plato is philosophy, and philosophy Plato, at once the glory and the shame of mankind. So there's, you know, then and on he goes. So there's this, you know, incredible reverence, and he calls him the great generalizer as well.
Can I also add, mysticism finds in Plato all its texts.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So some big claims, and you know, he goes on to enumerate figures like Cambridge Platonists, Cudworth, Thomas Taylor, Ficino, and so on. So he sets out what we've referred to at other times as a sort of golden thread or a golden chain, if you like, that you alluded to a little while back, Danny, that perhaps he sees himself within, in a sense, this perennial kind of philosophy, we could call it in some ways as well. And I think the address, just briefly, Eli, I wanted to say here, because of course Emerson also, as you point out, sits within a certain kind of tension with Christianity in different ways as well. And the talk you were referring to was his 1838 Harvard Divinity School address, in this refulgent summer, and so on and so forth, that sort of famous one. But yeah, but I just thought, you know, and there's also this interesting quote he says very early on in the Plato essay, which again situates us in this sort of space. He says his broad humanity transcends all sectional lines. So there's an idea here that, you know, Plato is for everyone.
Yeah, I think it would be, what was I going to say? Part of the reason I was pushing for this essay is people always read Circles or Oversoul, and, you know, these are sort of 30 something. He has come into his own. And this is, later in his life, this was something that started out as lecture circuit talks, for people who didn't have sort of introductions to sort of great world figures. So you can see this, like, you have to dig a little more because you can tell there's part of this that's like meant to be framed as an introductory text, but it's the way Emerson does an introductory text, which is really not, because it's also telling you how he wants people to think about things. And you sort of get an image of Plato, and I was even struck by his description of Platonism, which I think is so revealing of what he really wants people to take, which I'll just pull up here it is. The longest wave is quickly lost in the sea. Plato would willingly have a Platonism, a known and accurate expression for the world, and it would be accurate. It shall be the world passed through the mind of Plato, nothing less. Which should give you an idea of like how he thinks about what historical expression ought to be, which for him is a really interesting and strange one, like what we should get from great figures, and he'll do this with the others. It's not like the Platonism he wants you to see is not the Platonism of who read Plato and did this sort of commentary. It's like how it shaped the adventure of thought in human transformation and how it still echoes and lives us today. And that's both historical, but that's also universal and timeless. And I think he thinks about figures this way, like their influence, and probably I imagine he thinks about his Platonism is not like which ideas did I take from Plotinus and which did I take from Plato or from Proclus. It's like, how does this shape representative expression as it's coming to me in the live moment? And how does it and why is it so fascinating that Plato continues to do this for us? Which I just thought was, moving and interesting, and reveals a lot about how he thinks for himself about what he's taken in through the time.
Yeah, it's funny because for some strange reason, reading this essay, I thought of Derrida's postcards, and the way that some contemporary authors see the relationship between Plato and Socrates, and try to belittle it, and but here's a man, right, like, who gives the same kind of, like, sees how they influenced each other, sees the power of how Socrates kindled in Plato something that was already in Plato, and then Plato can still do this for us because he wasn't just a collector of the thoughts of other people, but was really trying to communicate this what is the word, marriage between the one and the many, or the finite and the infinite, that he was a philosopher who wanted to define, but only insofar as he saw the outside of the form, right, the beyond the form. And so he describes it in much the same way that Nietzsche does, as a marriage between East and West, right? And so that, I don't know, there's this perennial nature of, like, people who can do this marriage, or Emerson describes it as a kind of balance, that Plato is a balanced person, and so that's how inspirational he is, right? Is that we can see, how could you do the impossible, which is balance two poles, two extremes, but then we see it in ourselves, or we see it in Emerson, or we see it in others, and we realize, oh wait, they must have been remembering something rather than inventing something, or what is the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's not inventing. It's because he does have a sense in which the philosopher becomes demiurgic as well. It's more along the lines of the original is a copy, just like it is in Plato himself. And so, anyways, golden chain stuff again. So thank you.
No, it's like
I was reminded of a really beautiful thought there, and I'll connect this to a passage in the Plato essay. But there's a quotation. I have a volume of poems that was compiled by A.P. Wavell, who was a World War II field marshal in the Second World War. But he put together this collection of poems called Other Men's Flowers, and it's introduced with a short quotation attributed to Montaigne. I have gathered a posy of other men's flowers, and nothing but the thread that binds them is my own. And this is a sense what Emerson says of Plato. He says Plato stands between the truth and every man's mind, and has almost impressed language and the primary forms of thought with his name and seal. And then he talks about his modernness, but he says the perpetual modernness is the measure of merit in every work of art, since the author of it was not misled by anything short-lived or local, but abode by real and abiding traits. So there's this idea here that, you know, in any age, should the artist or the poet turn their attention to the right things, then they too can gather, if you like, these flowers, these treasures, these beautiful ideas together. Then, you know, what's contemporary, what's traditional, what's modern, what's archaic, these kind of ideas vanish. And I think that's what we recognize when we're moved by something beautiful, isn't it? Or a song, or a book, or you know, those kinds of ideas. They stand the test of time for a reason, and this is what I think he's speaking to here, and our ability to see that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't remember which essay I read it from in Emerson, but basically the idea that in these great human beings or great individuals, time encloses eternity or something along these lines, like that, you know, a day is, you know, an infinity for such individuals, and so that they can traverse all of it due to this kind of, marriage of impossibilities. And so.
Part of it is, you know, he very taken with this idea, a lot of people, Coleridge, though some access to Kant, of Kant's theory of genius, because what speaks to him, as it sort of does Nietzsche, is there's something, one of the signs of genius is its universal communicability, which is that great works, products of genius activity are those ones where we can always draw something modern and relevant out of. And what that came from is something we can't point to because it's not like a concept with easy categories that linear out. It's just like something that was the unique expression of each person. And why this is important to Emerson, and why he is, though Dewey became ambivalent about this full hyperbolic expression later, called him the first philosopher of democracy. But I think most of the sort of American philosophers of the next several generations certainly would call him the American Plato. And one of the big ideas they took from him was on this point, and it comes up especially in the essay Self-Reliance, that we are all unique expressions of the divine, and the problem is this our own foibles, limitations, self-hate, other things that block in the way of that unique expression. So in Emerson, there is no elite. There's only access for all of us to make those sort of genius products that will give to the world. And representative men are just, like he says, of like, you know, the particularly great geniuses. We all have access to genius, but they are like overstretched so much in one direction. Sometimes they can pull this aspect of the world that just needed like an extra little push out to bring out of them. But he does think they give the world as a whole, and they give the sort of infinite resource you wouldn't have. And, you know, I guess it kept reminding me of, in case you the audience is curious, you know, his list of which other men he chose is pretty fascinating, and it tells you a lot, which is Plato is like the first example chapter, but then Swedenborg for the mystic, Montaigne for the skeptic, Shakespeare for the poet, Napoleon for the man of the world. Though he uses or, which also tells you something about the sort of optional choice here, and Goethe as the writer. You know, and you know, you may wonder about Napoleon, about, you know, like the virtue of the human being he's selecting, but I think his response with Carlyle is like, well, we're not necessarily saying they were a moral exemplar, just that they were an expression of something deep and profound about humanity. It doesn't necessarily mean you would have to want to agree or like the person or think they're particularly good.
Yeah, I haven't read that essay just yet, but my intuition is that just like Plato, in some such fashion, reveres an Alcibiades because of this the same reason why Socrates wanted to be his first and only lover, which is to see this human potential and how it can go in one direction or the other. And if it had gone in the other direction, it would have been completely different. But the ambition, right? The ambitious soul is somebody you got to be on the lookout for. And it's an archetypical soul, like so Napoleon and Alcibiades, all of these people, they've got some greatness in them, but according to Socrates, or the way that Plato depicts them, is to show that they slipped into the not virtuous or moral, and so they became isolated into their own greatness, is what I'm going to assume he's going to say in that particular essay, because I see it depicted in Plato. And if I'm tracking Emerson's Platonism, then I imagine that's might be. You tell me though. I don't know. So.
It's been a while since I've done. I don't know, Gareth, if you did it. I haven't read the Napoleon. My memory is like the line goes like it's sort of embedded in there, but it's also like we all have a Napoleon in us, and so there's a good part of that because Emerson's sort of an eternal optimist about the knowledge and the good, even if Napoleon himself was overweening as
But that's what
with
the
Hegel
thing
here
about Alcibiades is that, like, the reason why Socrates was attracted to him was because this overripe, good and virtue that was actually by nature in his soul, the strength and all of these things, and that if you follow the Platonic idea, which Emerson also tracks, that no one willingly errs, right? It's because of this that the Zeus in us, right? What we saw in the great Hyper-Uranus is what leads to this ambition. But what's happened is we've mistaken ambition and world leadership for this actual greatness of leading your own soul. That is, and that's what the Neoplatonists, kind of tease out, is that somebody like Alcibiades is beautiful, is wonderful. Napoleon, there was something about him, probably, as Emerson might say, that if only had gone that way instead of this way. Just a silly mistake that we all.
Yeah, the only ambivalence I have is it's one because I was teaching Kassir on Carlyle about an essay in his book on the sort of arrival of modern politics about the problem with hero worship, which is both him and Carlyle have this ambivalence about heroes and these sort of great figures, that they do contribute something or a perennial aspect in a new way that we don't have language for. So they do rupture norms, and that's acceptable. But neither of them have quite like, well, what do you do if that person's, going to, murder a lot of people? They sort of get into the same problem Hegel does, that they accept the norms breaking is inevitable, but don't have a just sort of moral justification about like where it ends and begins. And an Emerson scholar here may be able to provide the subtlety. I don't, but I can feel that pull in him. He has the Nietzschean drive for the energy to express, but we know the danger of that pull too, within a figure. I'm not sure if that came up, Gareth, in the intro, because I didn't read the intro to hero worship. It's been a while. There were sort of thoughts about where he lands on this.
No, I love that, the kind of beyond good and evil aspect of what it means to be in touch with whatever this thing is. So I believe it's time we have to wrap up, but this is definitely, Gareth was saying earlier, it has to be another episode. So please, Eli, would you mind coming back next week?
Absolutely. And do we want to do like circles and oversoul, get into the more heady metaphysical stuff? Maybe we can just focus there. And I think that's always a good area to go.
I'd be excited. Gareth, maybe you want to have the last word before we close?
Oh, well, I mean, it's customary for me to give a quotation, but I mean, I don't know, where do you start with Emerson in many ways? But yeah, I mean, I think that it's been really fascinating jumping into this particular essay and thinking through these kind of key ideas, which in a way all emanate just out of this single case study, in a way, of Plato. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting next time for us to jump into some of his more metaphysical writings, let's say, where he starts to elucidate something of his own philosophy as well. Yeah, every great artist has been such by synthesis. So, this kind of bringing together, and I think that's something you can see in his writing. So, yeah, thanks. Good to have you here, Eli. And yeah, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yeah, I look forward to part two. Always fascinating. And yeah, for me, I just wanted to say your feeling about the quotableness. Whenever I read Emerson, it's constantly frustrating because I just want to highlight like half the essay because he's so good at these, coins of phrases and images. So he's also eminently frustrating that way.
Well, he even says it of Plato, that Plato never ran out of nicknames, right? And so I think that's some of the things that he, draws from that particular well is yeah, words have power and meaning and magic. And so, all right, on that note, thank you.